on drones and modern statecraft. It's going to be a fascinating conversation around the ways in which drones are helping us to hopefully stay out of conflicts, although I am very fascinated to hear how the current conflict might be changing some of the thinking around that. For those who don't know, my name is Tim Horgan. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, and I want to thank our in-person audience for joining us here today, as well as our online audience and our friends who will be watching the recording of this. So thank you so much for taking the time to come and go from, and this is my new favorite tagline that I just came up with yesterday, so give me all the praise you can, where we're taking you guys from awareness to understanding. For those who do not know about the World Affairs Council, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. Therefore, we do not take stances on any institutional policies, on politics, on parties, all of the fun P words out there. We are simply the platform for conversation, and we want you to do with the information you receive from our programming what you will. This is your opportunity to hear from amazing experts in the field about what is really going on in the world. Also, as a nonprofit, we are a membership organization, and we thrive because of all of you people here, all of the people behind the scenes who support this work by being members, donors, supporters, and sponsors. We cannot do this without a strong community behind us, and so we thank everyone who is already a supporter in some way, shape, or form of this organization. And we invite those who are not yet members to talk with us about membership and joining this wonderful community. What I love about what we do here is that we can have challenging conversations, but nobody leaves being yelled at. Nobody leaves being called a racist, a fascist, a communist, whatever ist you want to put out there. We are here to have accurate conversations and to truly understand the world. So thank you, especially to the Ayers family for their ongoing support of this series. Pat and Bill Ayers were wonderful supporters of our organization, and their family continues to hold their memory in their honor, as well as to the New Hampshire chapter of the Fulbright Association. Larry French is here with us today, so Larry, I'll invite you up to say a few words from your organization.
I think as you probably know, the Fulbright Association is celebrating its 80th year. That means few you out there were just kids, right, when it started? I know I was just 5. So 80 years. And this was a very good thing. I think this came out of the influence of the Truman administration. The idea was that there was some type of conflict going on at that time, to us too young to understand it then, but that we had to somehow try to preserve democracies throughout the world. So it did have an influence. The thing is that since then, it's been a very, very valuable instrument professionally for people, because being a Fulbrighter means a lot. I mean, that's usually one of the things you put on your resume or your CV, and a lot of people think that's a good thing to have. Sometimes it's difficult, and there are different levels to do it. So what we're trying to do, and this group, especially at St. Anselm's, that's where we now have a couple of the offices. I'm on the board, and a couple of the president and another member is from St. Anselm's, and like I say, it's Bill Devine and I. We were represented from the UNH, but it doesn't have much support anymore. So there is different levels. Like first of all, you can have a person who is a undergraduate, and probably has and can have up to a master's, but not into a doctoral program, and they can become one of the student Fulbright. In other words, they go to another country, and they usually are teaching English as a second language. This is a very good experience for them. A lot of these countries have what they call the American Center, and so it's a good experience, and it's like doing a lap year in Europe or wherever you're going to be at, Asia. So this is all over, but it's to me it's the experience, and my experience. They're interested in world affairs. I grew up in Suncook, New Hampshire. It's a little French-Canadian town. When I grew up in it, pretty isolated. My grandparents and my mother didn't speak English. So when I joined the Marine Corps at 17, and that's what cool, we had our hero, Rennie Gagnon, who helped raise the flag in Iwo Jima. So a bunch of us joined the Marine Corps. That was our thing. But we didn't know anything about the world. I mean, I was never south of Suncook or Manchester into Boston. Matter of fact, we went to Quebec to see our, as we called them, our relators. And so that was, you're in isolation. But when I got to the Marine Corps, that ended. I mean, because, Paris Island, and then we went to, right away, there was the Congo crisis. We were on the 6th Fleet, and we were in during the Algerian crisis. Franco was the dictator of Spain. De Gaulle was the dictator of France. Italy had a different president every month. Greece was just getting over its civil war. And you're a young kid, and you're exposed to all of this, Come back, Cuba. They said, all right, now you get, because I was in artillery and fire direction control. So right away they sent us to Cuba in '61 to evacuate all the Navy dependents and the white Cubans who fled into Guantanamo to leave. And then after that, right away, I got so used to that, I went to the 3rd Marine Division, which was occupied Okinawa, and there we did the Philippines, we did Hong Kong. I was in Komoya Matsu, the last China event in January 1963, and then of course that ended because somebody gave China the atomic bomb, so that conflict ended. So you come back and you don't know what any of this means. I mean, you have the experiential first, and none of the understand it. So they sent me to, on the GI Bill. I went on the GI Bill. But I finally got back to New Hampshire, and one of my professors there, Val Doucette, he was so, we're the same age, but he one of the affluent people that get their doctorate at 26, come from the right family. But he was amazed that I had all this experience, but he had all this knowledge. And so he taught me logic and other things to look at, which led to the issue of my interest in restorative justice and social justice. So after working in minority communities, universities, HBCUs, Hispanic-driven universities, working with Native Americans.
They're just having a little trouble hearing you online.
All right. And so these experiences, I finally figured that I'm going to try and do a Fulbright. And so I was at UN. Now I was like an affiliate at UNH because I got 3 of my degrees there. And so I got Val Doucette to sponsor me on this here, and I got one to Bosnia. As I was telling, the John Jay College had this thing. They jumped in on the bandwagon after the end of the Soviet Union, this end of former Yugoslavia. So I was in Ljubljana in 2002, and then in 2004, the UN sent me and another guy from Jackson State University to, by bus, through all these roadblocks, where they come out, you got somebody sticking an AKA in your face, and you're gonna have to be stopped. They take your passport. All these roadblocks through Croatia. Finally got to Republic of Srpska to look at a UN-built police academy, which is now part of the University of Banja Luka. What they didn't want is they didn't want any local people building it because of all the corruption in that area. And I mean, there's a lot of corruption. And so they had all these outsiders come in. I guess Germans, other people built it. And then from there, I got interested and got the Fulbright as a senior Fulbright scholar at the University of Sarajevo, 2009 and 2010. And of course, the whole thing then was the Dayton Accord. There was the Kosovo, Macedonia, a conflict that went into 2002. There was this whole thing about exclusion of certain people. There was the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. There was the fact that Croatians, Catholic Croatians, Muslim Bosniaks, and Orthodox Catholics, that these people could vote, but Jews and Roma were excluded. And we wrote the Constitution for them. The other thing is their Constitution was written in English. So nobody that I would know that could read it, you know what I mean? They had to get it translated. So a lot of things happened then, and I got exposed to all the different sides. And I learned one thing about this thing, about the strength of sectarian biases and sectarian interactions. And that is a very, very difficult thing to overcome. And that's what people don't realize. It's not always this economic, this simplistic, mental, militaristic thing. Like this, you cannot destroy the mind, and that's a more difficult thing to change. So I was interested in social justice, restorative justice. Then a few years later, in 2016, they're still dealing with post-traumatic stress. And what they wanted somebody over there is to bring American technique, American skills. America was really good in producing clinical techniques. So I had the MMPI translated, the mental status exam, all of these things translated so they could start dealing with post-traumatic stress. And the thing was that secondary post-traumatic stress was the real issue. In other words, the kids whose parents suffered in the war. Now there was 40,000 uncleared mines in Bosnia when I was there, and the kids would go out there playing football, what we call soccer, and they blow a leg off or an arm. So I was really, really busy doing that, and then they had me come to Croatia. They had me do it in Serbia, Macedonia. So just kept me busy. And then 2016, they had me come to deal with the survivors of the atrocities. And that was very, very difficult. I had to meet with these people, and things weren't resolved. And that was with the Republic of Srpska, which was the Minister of the Interior. After that, they decided to have independent international commissions to look at the victims throughout all of Bosnia and Kosovo and Serbia, like Vojvodina area, to see what was the commonality of the issues. See, a lot of people would think that they didn't suffer as much as us because they're the bad guys. They had a common problem if you looked at the diagnosis and not at the sectarian biases. And so I was the only one or two Americans on these commissions, which we concluded a couple of years ago. And these other people came from all over the world, like I say, Nigeria, Japan, Austria, Australia, France, and we're all different expertise, and we had to come up using that blank slate social justice model, where you don't say we diminished that because those were the bad guys, and we looked at the issues and we came up with this idea about what the problem was, and we developed two 1,000-page documents on it, which is and I wrote on this. So Fulbright, to me, has been a very valuable avenue for expressing. Now, I know most of the people I worked with had safe Fulbrights, what I call safe Fulbrights. Work with a library, work with the museum, work with the education. And a lot of them took advantage as a tourist Fulbrighter. You know, we're going to go here, we're going to go there, we're going to see this. They brought their spouse. But to me, I learned from the Marine Corps. And they said, oh, do you want Skype? No, I don't want any of this stuff. I'm there for 9 months. I'll use email occasionally, let my wife know I'm still alive. But that's it. I don't want to contaminate. I don't want to walk in two worlds. I have to immerse myself into their world. And I did that. And it gave me a lot of insights. I had no tourist stuff because they had me going to all these places in Serbia, all these Macedonia, all these places doing this post-traumatic stress, which was, to me, was worth it, more worth than going to these other places which I've been to or I'm going to or whatever. So I really think that Fulbright, to me personally, was a very strong cornerstone of my experience, my professional experience, which I will not ever forget. And I think Bill before me said this, and others have said it. It's very important. So I encourage you, if you know anybody, to put in for the Fulbright. They have this. Now it's done by the World Learning instead of the IIE, and you can go onto their sites. And once you have a regular Fulbright, whether it's a student or as a scholar, then you can put in for the specialist. And I was telling Tim that this is good because this gives you the opportunity to work with another country with their issue. My most recent one was 2019 in the state of Sinaloa in Mexico. And what I did there, they had their first indigenous university, an autonomous university system in Mexico. Sinaloa, the drug capital of Mexico. I was there, and then I was supposed to leave on October 19th, 2019, and they had the big shootout in Culiacan. So they had to sneak me out, had to take me from down to Mexico City. I had to hide out at the airport until the State Department could get me back. But the event, even though that was I haven't had a scare like that since the Marine Corps, even though that was pretty scary, even for an old guy, the thing is that the overall thing was worthwhile because I've had good contacts. We're going to be meeting in Albuquerque at some meetings, the World Social Science Association next week, the same with the colleagues. So it's a good network. So I really want to promote it. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Okay. Well, thank you again to the Fulbright Association for your support of this and for being such a wonderful partner. I'd like now to bring up Dr. Erik Lin-Greenberg, our speaker for the evening. If you'll join me up here. Dr. Lin-Greenberg is an associate professor at MIT. He is the author of the book, The Remote Revolution, Drones and Modern Statecraft, which is the title of our conversation here tonight. He is also a 2020 awardee of the Mertz Tate Award from the American Association of course I put down the political science. I put down the acronym. I thought I would remember it. But in addition to that, he is a Air Force reservist, squad commander for an air wing, and formerly full-time active duty in the Air Force. So someone who certainly has a lot of great background, a lot of great opportunities to discuss drones and what they're doing, to how ways in which countries, governments, non-state actors are interacting with each other and changing the rules of war. So Dr. Lin-Greenberg, of course, first off, welcome and thank you for joining us. I want to level set a little bit because for probably 20 plus years, we've been hearing the term drone, but that could mean a UAV, a UAS, an uncrewed system, now submersibles. A lot has changed over the years since we first heard this term. So when we talk about drones, and when you're talking about drones in your book, what are we actually talking about here?
Sure. So thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone for being here. I realize it's St. Patrick's Day. I know there's an Irish bar down the block where people might rather be than talking about drones. But let's start by level setting, right? And so I think fundamentally a drone, and we'll talk about these different detailed characteristics, but the core characteristic that makes a drone is that it's unmanned, right? That the operator is not sitting on board the vehicle, whether it's an air-based vehicle, whether it's something that's operating on the seas or underwater or on land. It's interesting that you said, well, we've been hearing about these things for about 20 years. And I think the reason we often think about drones over the last 2 decades is because I think most of us think about drones as a post-9/11 tool, right? We think about it as something that played this core role in the global war on terrorism. That's where I started my career as an Air Force officer, was working in a drone unit, essentially. But there's a really, really long history of drones, and I think it's important to talk about this because it helps us understand the context in which drones are used and how that either has or hasn't changed over time. So there's been drones in the air domain for nearly as long as there's been powered flight. The US Army tried in the 19-teens to develop a drone-based system that is really the predecessor to the modern cruise missile. During World War II, the US military actually deployed a number of drones. They were trying to use these systems to attack infrastructure that we were really having a challenge with attacking. So we're thinking about V2 production facilities, submarine pens, and in many cases, these were bombers that were loaded up with explosives. They were droned once they got over enemy territory. So you'd put a pilot on board, the pilot would fly over the English Channel, bail out of the plane, and then you hope that this thing would hit a target. One of the Kennedy sons was actually killed when one of these drones prematurely exploded. But then you see drones being used throughout the Cold War, trying to develop systems to deliver nuclear weapons. They were used extensively in Vietnam to collect intelligence. And the US military says, well, for collecting on Vietnam, let's push a little bit further north and see what military assistance the Chinese are providing. And so that's when you start seeing drones actually operating over well-defended airspace. There's a number of drones that are designed to fly deep into Western China to go spy on China's nuclear program. And again, the use cases continue to develop. So Larry was talking about the Balkans. That is really the first kind of, I would call it, modern drone use case of a reusable drone that's able to land like an airplane. So the CIA is operating Predator drones over the Balkans. And then you see this use of drones in the air domain after 9/11. And then since then, as technology has advanced, you have maritime drones, which we're seeing the Ukrainians use quite extensively, land-based drones, so vehicles, which both the Ukrainians, the Israelis have used, and then obviously air-based drones as well.
And we've seen a lot of different uses for these drones, and each one has their own particular mission, we'll call it. You have tiny drones that are the size of an insect. You have massive, large drones that are the size of an airplane or a crewed ship. Can you talk a little bit about, in modern day, or the past 10, 15 years or so, what has been the main missions of these systems, and why have states in particular, and we can get to the non-state stuff later, why are states going to use these technologies?
So I think the primary use case that you've seen for drone use was reconnaissance, right? This was an opportunity to, in many cases, at least in the air domain, to deploy an asset that wasn't constrained by essentially the human body, right? There's only so long that a human can sit before they need to go to the bathroom, but you can have a drone operating over enemy terrain for dozens of hours. And you're also, by removing the crew from on board, you're reducing the amount of risk involved. So initially, drones were being used for reconnaissance purposes. Shortly after 9/11, we start weaponizing drones in the US context, so using missiles that had been carried on helicopters to go carry out precision strikes. So those are the two primary use cases that we see today, as reconnaissance and then these strike operations. And again, they're used for kind of two primary reasons. One is because they are reducing risk, but then the other is just the operational benefit of having something that can essentially carry out multiple phases of what we might consider to be the kill chain using a single asset. So hypothetically, if I wanted to carry out an airstrike in the past, I would need to have an intelligence asset go collect that intelligence. I would need some kind of fighter aircraft or attack aircraft to go attack that aircraft. I would then need some kind of refueling aircraft. I would need a search and rescue package. So you have a massive number of aircraft associated with this. Now, in many cases, you have a one-size solution where you can conduct that entire kill chain using one platform like the MQ-9 Reaper.
And one of the things that we've been hearing a lot more recently, but of course has been featured prominently in the Russia-Ukraine war, is the one-way kamikaze, if you will, drone. What is that platform? Can you talk a little bit how the U.S. has kind of copied the Shahad drone and how that's featuring in battles today?
Right. So I think, when many of us think about drones, we think of something that looks like the Predator, that has bombs that are going to drop off of its wings or missiles that drop off of its wings that can be reused. After it lands, you'll restock it and have this thing take off again. That requires some pretty significant logistical lift. Even though it's an unmanned aircraft, there's a huge logistical tail to that. It requires a pretty robust communications network to actually operate that system. What we've seen, many of our competitors do is to start using these one-way attack drones. So to think of these as essentially relatively cheap cruise missiles. We'll talk about the Shahed in a second, but as you mentioned earlier, there's a whole range of drones, right? So some of the first, I would call them one-way attack drones, were DJI drones that you can go buy off of Amazon for less than $1,000. You take a grenade, you attach essentially a shuttlecock from badminton, and you were using those to drop weapons. So the Taliban was attempting to do this. You had insurgent groups throughout the Middle East using this kind of technology because it gave them a type of reach that they didn't previously have, right? You could fly over a target that was well defended and engage that target with, again, little risk to your own forces. And so we've seen this type of technology kind of magnify and be used by state actors as well. So the Shahed 136 is something that now all of you have seen on the news. If you've watched the news in the last week, you have seen the Shahed 136 in use. It's an Iranian one-way attack drone. Sounds like a lawnmower. Has a range of several hundred to thousands of miles, a warhead on board, and it can be used to target infrastructure. And the great thing is these are highly maneuverable, easy to hide, right? They can be launched very, very quickly off of a launcher, and that launcher can then move and go launch another system. So it's providing essentially a relatively weaker actor with the ability to carry out precision-guided strikes. These systems have been so effective that the Iranians have exported these worldwide. The Russians have used them and are now producing them for use against Ukraine. And then in this bizarre kind of twist, the United States realized, well, why don't we reverse engineer this thing? It's been so effective, in the arsenals of our adversaries. Let's take this tool and make it our own. So a small U.S. producer is now building these drones. They were used for the first time in combat earlier this month against Iran. It's called the Lucas. So the low-cost unmanned combat aerial system looks just like the Shahed. And again, it's about cost advantage in this case. Most US missile systems, so Tomahawks and things of that nature, are incredibly expensive. The Lucas, according to public reporting, costs somewhere between $10,000 and $35,000 a shot. So a fraction of the cost of what missiles that can arguably achieve similar effects cost.
And then the final level setting question I have is, and I don't think we're here yet, but the idea of swarms. Can you talk a little bit about what people mean when they're talking about drone swarms?
Sure. So I think the best example of a drone swarm is if you go on YouTube and watch these great Chinese New Year's presentations by the Chinese, where you have essentially lots of drones operating simultaneously. They're collaborating with each other, and The Chinese are primarily using these for light shows. But you could imagine taking that kind of capability and putting it into the military context. So large numbers of drones. No one has identified exactly what the bottom number of drones is required for something to be a swarm, but essentially large numbers of drones operating collaboratively. And in many cases, you might think about this as something that would take down an air defense network, right? You're just throwing lots and lots of assets at a system that you're trying to take down and trying to make that a very, very difficult task for the defender to engage and stop these. And so there's been a lot of experimentation. So the Naval Postgraduate School and many universities have done all kinds of collaborative swarming tests. But I think one of the really interesting things that, as we think about the military applications, the last Deputy Secretary of Defense, so Kath Hicks, came up with something that she called the Replicator Initiative, and this was one of her primary objectives, was how do we find a way to have precise mass? So essentially, finding a way to have cheap assets that are expendable, but having a lot of them that you could essentially do some type of swarming technique. And the Lucas that we talked about earlier was one of those assets that came out of this. Again, not a swarm type of asset, but something that is dramatically lowering the price and allows us to increase the number of assets that we're sending towards an adversary.
Okay. Your book, The Remote Revolution, Drones and Modern Statecraft, you can buy it online. Great book. Can you talk us through what, in your understanding, is the remote revolution?
Sure. So there's been, I think, a lot of ink spill trying to understand, whether or not drones are fundamentally changing things on the battlefield, right? Are drones revolutionary in changing the way that states fight wars? But if we look at a lot of the use cases of drones in recent years, much of the use cases actually happen outside of combat settings. They're used by states and non-state actors to engage in this interesting kind of coercive diplomacy against each other. So I think one of the prime examples of this is in 2019, the summer of 2019, the Iranians shoot down a US Navy drone operating over the Arabian Gulf. This is a peacetime setting. Tensions were high. It was during the first Trump administration. We had pulled out of the JCPOA. Tensions were ratcheting up. Iranian malign groups are kind of attacking US infrastructure, embassies, and oil tankers in the Arabian Gulf. And they end up shooting down this RQ-4 drone, so an incredibly expensive drone. And what's really interesting is the Iranian air defense commander later comes out publicly and says, look, we could have shot down this manned Navy patrol aircraft that was operating close by to this drone. But we made a deliberate decision to shoot down the drone. We wanted to signal to the American, aggressors our discontent here, but we didn't want to risk killing American service members. So they were essentially using this as something that's a little bit more intense than just a diplomatic message, but less intense on the escalation ladder than actually killing Americans. And what's fascinating is the American response. According to public reporting, the U.S. ends up really not taking any kinetic action. President Trump orders the development of military plans and then calls off an attack. And the great thing about this is President Trump, during his first term, was tweeting about his thought logic here. And he says, look, killing Iranian service members is not equivalent to the downing of a machine. And so we end up carrying out ostensibly some type of cyber operation, if we believe what the kind of public record says about this. So the remote revolution essentially says you have these new tools that are creating these new rungs on the escalation ladder that allow for more intense and more frequent interactions, but you have less escalation. So you have a lot more of these interactions, but these interactions typically don't escalate. So you're creating this new zone of escalation in which states can communicate in the language of drones.
And it's interesting that you started talking about the use of drones in peacetime, but of course we see them used in multiple places, Ukraine, Gaza, Iran, many more places we could go on all night listing. But what is your theory say about the use of drones within conflict settings?
Sure. So I think some of that logic still applies, right? Losing a machine is far less emotionally taxing and far less strategically taxing to a state than losing service members. So the Wall Street Journal reported last night that the U.S. has lost probably upwards of a dozen drones over Iran in the past few weeks of combat. That rarely makes it to the news headlines, right? It's something that we consider to be expendable. You could imagine if we lost 12 fighter jets and lost those crew members on board, the US would likely have wanted to carry out more intense retaliatory measures, potentially escalating this conflict even more than what we've seen. So I think some of the logic still applies. I think one of the other interesting ways that the remote revolution logic applies in combat settings is it allows you to create these interesting areas of non-war within wars. And so what do I mean by that? So early in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, you started seeing Ukraine carrying out these really interesting attacks using drones deep within Russian territory. And they were doing this for a few reasons, right? One, it was this coercive signal that shows that they were able to hold Russian targets at risk. They were able to do so in a relatively low-risk manner, again, by sending in these machines instead of humans. And initially, Russia ignored that these were happening, right? So you created this world in which you have these interesting areas where you can geographically extend conflict outside of the battlefields.
And that reminds me of one of the most fascinating attacks of that conflict, that war, where basically unsuspecting Russians were hired to move trucks throughout Russia that then opened up and released hundreds of drones outside of airfields. So there are some really creative things going on out there in the use of drones. What is your favorite use story of a drone?
So I think there's a few. One of them is Operation Spiderweb, which you just alluded to, and this is this Ukrainian use of drones against Russia's long-range aviation fleet, so their nuclear bomber force. And as you said, Russian truck drivers ended up driving these trucks that look like pre-built homes, and then all of a sudden the roofs of these trucks popped off, and the Ukrainians were able to destroy elements of Russia's strategic bomber force. What I think is really interesting about this particular use case is it shows how this technology is allowing states to get essentially precision-guided munitions on the cheap, right? And so precision-guided munitions are, in many cases, a relatively limited commodity. They're an expensive commodity. But what we're seeing, in the case of drones, is that you're able to combine drone technology with things like GPS navigation systems, and even relatively weak actors can now carry out precision-guided attacks. So I think it's fundamentally changing, how we think about precision-guided attacks. My other favorite drone use story actually happens during the Cold War, where the U.S. is flying these drones over China, and the Chinese shoot down a bunch of these drones. And they make a huge deal in Chinese press, right? They tell the public that the valiant PLA aviators are defending Chinese airspace from the American imperialists. And if you look at the archival record, which the book draws from, there's this great exchange by some folks on the Joint Staff who are trying to figure out what to do as these things are being, essentially shot down. And one of the people says, well, these things have like plates that say made in Ohio or something on the engine. What are we going to do? And this colonel says, don't worry about it. There's no American in prison. Just sit there and let them shoot these things down. It doesn't really matter. And the Chinese end up putting these on display in Tiananmen Square. Thousands of people go see them, and there is no escalation, right? And I think that's this really, really cool story that captures this remote revolution idea. We project power to achieve some kind of military objective, to let the Chinese know we're watching them. They shoot these things down, tell their domestic public, hey, look, we're telling the Americans to back off, and we don't see any escalation. And
we've seen, and sorry, I'm just checking for online questions, so if you see me pulling my phone out, that's what I'm looking for. But we've seen here in the United States responses to drone incursions. Mm-hmm. We saw the El Paso airport shut down for Mexican cartel drones. We saw DOD shoot down Border Patrol drone. What are we seeing in terms of the use cases that are a little bit closer to home?
Sure. So I think many of us probably saw that warning from the FBI last week saying that there's potential the Iranians would use some type of drone against California, right? Came back saying it was unsubstantiated. But I think there is a sizable drone threat to the United States. Not necessarily adversaries flying drones into our airspace, But these are relatively cheap systems. The barrier to entry to acquiring a drone is very, very low. All of you could pull out your phones now and order one off of Amazon. It'll be sitting on your doorsteps tomorrow. And you could choose to use this for nefarious purposes, right? If you could take a drone and take it to a local airport, fly it around, you will stop air traffic there, right? And so we saw this, in major European aviation hubs earlier, I guess it was late last year. And so that type of relatively easy drone use can have massive effects on commerce, trade, and just the psyche of the public when you're terrified that a Boeing 737 might suck in a small drone and have to make an emergency landing.
And I forget which Western state it is, but I believe if there's a drone flying above your property, you are legally able to shoot at it with your shotgun. I don't know. So I'm just glad that that's not here. Anyway, so the final thing that and you've kind of alluded to it, the final thing I wanted to do before we turn it to audience questions, we do have a mic that Larry will come around with for in person and online. Scan the QR code, go to slido.com, email us at council@wacnh.org. Any of those ways, I'll find you. Thank you for your questions. But reshaping the power dynamics between non-state actors, governments, powerful governments, weaker governments. What are the dynamic shifts that are going on right now within that space?
So I think there's two. One shift is on the military balance, right? The fact that you have a state like Iran now able to hold targets across the Middle East at risk, in large part using drone strikes, is mind-boggling, right? The fact that you can have a state develop a relatively low-cost weapon system that has the range and also a warhead on it to hold arguably the most powerful state at risk, I think shows just how these can shift the military balance. So that's one thing. The second type of shift that I think is important is as drones proliferate, you have a whole host of new actors that are getting involved. So Turkey, for instance, is a large-scale drone exporter. If you think back just a few decades, you would not think of Turkey as a large military exporter. The fact that Russia is buying drone technology from Iran is something that you would not think about a few decades ago. And these states that are exporting drones are reaping massive benefits from this, right? Both financially, but also in some cases diplomatically. So you have a state like Turkey that can export drones to client states and then ask essentially for diplomatic favors in return. And so you're seeing essentially these shifting, I call it the international political economy of drone exports.
So I'll turn to the in-person audience first. If we have any questions here, I do have a few from our online audience that I can work in as you think through. Larry, can you bring it to Larry, please, up here in the front? And Larry French, just speak direct. This is our bad microphone, so speak directly into it so people online can hear. Sorry.
One of the things that...
Sorry, Larry, can you just hold it this way? It's
Can you hear
really
me?
weird. Yeah, there we go.
What about the sea drones? I mean, I thought that was pretty important, too, and that might play a role with what's going on now in Iran.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Ukrainians were able to sink a large portion of the Russian fleet, despite Ukraine not really having much of a navy. And part of that was their use of unmanned surface vehicles, where they were essentially taking small speedboats, modifying them to be optionally or entirely remotely operated, filling them with explosives, and then driving them into the side of vessels. Again, highly maneuverable. It's a threat that I think initially the Russians were not prepared to respond to. That's not the kind of threat that they had trained against. And if you look at some of the footage that was released early on in the conflict, you see essentially Russian Air Force helicopter crews just trying to fire at these things as they're zigzagging along the water. So I think trying to find defenses against these has been a challenge. And I think the same type of technology could potentially be used by the Iranians. There's been a significant amount of open source reporting suggesting that the Iranians have the same type of capability. And I think there's this other element here that there's been a massive amount of learning from the Ukraine war. People have seen the Ukrainians kind of innovation base and are adopting those technologies. Both U.S. allies and U.S. adversaries are taking in these techniques and tactics.
Yeah, Robert.
So in that connection, almost nightly, you see on the news how the Ukrainian battlefield has been changed by the presence of drones. And most dramatically to me are tanks going around with chain link on them. I wonder, is the expeditionary force now deployed into the Middle East, those 2,500 soldiers, are they equipped, other than jamming? I understand that they have jamming technology for sure, but what are the techniques that they're going to be used to defend themselves from Iranian drones?
And actually, sorry, that ties in with one of our online questions. Steve Upton was wondering about counter-drone technology, specifically lasers, and how drones may actually be designed to counteract some of those things, reflective surfaces, et cetera.
So I think what's incredibly difficult about downing drones is the cost exchange ratio is not in the favor of the defender. We use incredibly expensive weapon systems to down incredibly cheap drones. And that just doesn't work, right? If you're using Patriot missile batteries or AMRAAM missiles that cost millions of dollars a shot to engage these relatively inexpensive assets, it doesn't work. So what we've seen is the development of a variety of different tools. Some are kinetic, so using relatively low-cost interceptors. You've seen the Ukrainians, again, being quite innovative, flying in these 1950s era aircraft with shotguns and shooting at drones. You've seen the development of essentially drones that are being used to crash into other drones to take them out of the sky. You're seeing the use of traditional surface-to-air missile systems and also air-to-air missile systems. There's great footage online of this just in the recent conflict. So I think it's either an Emirati or a Qatari fighter jet shooting down a Shahed drone using a surface-to-air missile. Again, that's expensive. But there's been a development of a number of kind of directed energy weapons that are much cheaper per shot that are designed to down these systems. So you mentioned jamming. That can work in certain cases, and this gets to be super technical about the type of navigation system a drone has, right? If I have essentially radio communications with a drone, jammers work. If it's using GPS guidance systems, a GPS jammer potentially works in throwing that off. But what we've seen, and you've probably seen these images of the battlefields of Ukraine, they're littered essentially with fiber optic cable, which is not jammable. So how do you down a system like that in a way that is cost effective? And in many cases, it's trying to find a directed energy weapon that can burn something, trying to cut a giant, flying Edward Scissorhands, or in some cases, even birds. There's some countries have developed falcons that are designed to go swoop down and take out drones. But again, this gets back to this opening question that we had of drones kind of fall along this massive spectrum from tiny little quadcopters that are about this big to things that are the size of a regional jet. So Falcon's not going to take out a regional jet size thing, but it could take out a quadcopter. So getting back to your specific question about, what does this Marine unit have? I don't know their specific weapons capabilities, but the Marines have highly publicized their tests of directed energy weapons and really low-cost systems to take drones out. So people have probably seen the Sea-Wiz, this close-in weapon system. It looks like R2-D2 with a machine gun. So essentially bullets that are shooting down inbound aircraft, things like that, are going to be likely a key weapon in defending U.S. assets in the Gulf.
Firing about 4,500 rounds per minute. Sorry, Chris. I think you had a question. Did you have a question? No, Aaron had it. Aaron. That's all right.
It took the cutting the wire.
Yeah,
Cut the wire.
we're practicing our drone defense here.
So I'm going to give this question to my 16-year-old son credit for him because he's writing a paper right now on drones in the Ukraine war.
Well, he should have shown up tonight.
You know, he's away in London on a school trip. But
Well, I hope he's tuning in.
one of the things I thought that was really interesting that he was talking to us about was that the drones are actually changing the boots on the ground and the way that the soldiers are reacting. And in Ukraine, the drones will come in and people will be almost in like World War I foxholes. And then just the constant drone being there will drive them to run out of the foxhole and then be shot. So I was just wondering how it's changing on the ground, like combat as well.
So I think there's a few ways to answer this question. The first is about the psychology of battlefield effects, and then there's another element about the actual military effects. So in terms of psychology, I think there is this absolute fear, right? People can hear drones, and it changes the ways they behave. And there's tons of footage of the battlefields in Ukraine, on the front lines in Russia, of just soldiers being terrified of these drones and actually taking their own lives because they'd rather do that than risk, what happens when a drone strike happens. So you potentially have people's battlefield behavior changing, but it's not just in traditional battlefields where you have the psychological effect. Over the skies of Beirut, currently, you can hear Israeli drones all the time. There was some great New York Times coverage talking about this and how this has become ingrained in the day-to-day lives of people in Beirut and across Lebanon, so much so that you have DJs integrating the sounds of drones into music just because it is such a part of the daily experience there. There's another element of the psychological effect of drones that I think is also important to talk about, not just the people on the physical battlefield, but we have to think about what the battlefield means when we think about a drone, right? These systems are uninhabited, but there are people in many cases operating these systems. So I started my military career in what's called a distributed ground station, which is a site that analyzes all the data coming in off of drones. And we often think about drones as this kind of video game-like warfare. I can tell you it is not. People are sitting at bases, in the United States. They commute to the battlefield, right? When I showed up at my base, which was in Northern California, there was a sign that said, "Welcome to the area of responsibility." And I would walk into Afghanistan or Iraq every day, sit there for 12 hours of my life, and then drive home. And so I was a single 22-year-old, but imagine you are a mother who's going to leave shift, go pick up your child from daycare, and then go home after seeing things. So you have this massive psychological effect on both the operators, and then also on the folks in the battlefield, and trying to think about how to care for those people from a long-term standpoint is important. So that's a psychological element. But then there's also this battlefield element of how does this actually change things on the battlefield. So we know that people might behave differently if they know they're being watched. And this gets back to a point that you raised earlier about tanks, right? I think one of the questions is, well, does the proliferation of drones obviate kind of these call them old school weapon systems and old school tactics? I don't think so, right? In order to hold territory, you need men and women on the ground, you need forces on the ground. So I don't think the age of the tank is dead. They're going to modify tanks to operate in new ways. They'll make tanks smaller, more maneuverable, but you'll still have ground forces down the road.
And since you mentioned London, I read an interesting article that British soldiers were in Ukraine advising the Ukrainians on warfighting just like last year. And the Ukrainians asked, okay, well, how do you protect your supply lines against drones? And the British soldiers were like, what do you mean? They're like, well, we're building like these nets and tunnels to catch these drones. And the British were like, yeah, we should probably think about this. So there's a lot of learning going on. And then I think a lot of the conversation has centered around kinetic use, military use. But what about domestic surveillance use? How are governments and non-state actors using drones to surveil their own people, and what can or should be done about it?
Sure. So this is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, right? I'm a scholar of international relations, but we know that governments around the world are using drones for domestic purposes. In some cases, you have drones that look very much like military drones being used for domestic surveillance purposes. So the Department of Homeland Security actually maintains a fleet of Reaper-type drones that they use to patrol the borders. And again, they're using this because of the long legs, right? You can have a system flying for hours and hours. You have many major police departments actually acquiring drones to monitor large crowds. And you can see them. So I was in Austria for some research earlier this spring, and the Austrian police were getting ready for a large parade, and there was a drone unit just operating in the street. So highly visible. But I think it does raise interesting questions about privacy concerns and monitoring and things of that nature. But you do see these systems kind of all over the place. And then you asked about non-state actors as well. So I think there's a host of ways that non-state actors are using these. Again, non-state actors, whole different spectrum of different types of actors. We'll start on the good side of non-state actors. So you can imagine non-governmental organizations, in some cases, are using drones to deliver medical care to remote areas where it'd be difficult to send physicians and things like that. You have a number of wildlife conservation organizations that are using drones to look for poachers. So they're, again, learning from the military applications and using drones essentially for good. On the not so good side of the house, right, we see drones being used to traffic drugs and narcotics across borders, also to get weapons and things into prisons is another use case that we've seen. And then potentially the use of drones in a kinetic sense by non-state actors, again, using these essentially as a flying improvised explosive device.
We're getting a lot of questions online about the integration of AI into drone systems. How do we keep ourselves safe? How do we ensure we're not creating killer robots that are going to go out there and indiscriminately kill us all? What are your thoughts around AI use with drones?
So I think it's happening, right? I think there's a desire for AI because it can move faster than in many cases a human decision maker. You can think if our adversaries are using AI, there's likely going to be a push to use AI as well, just to make sure we don't fall too far behind adversaries. But what I think is interesting is the Department of Defense has a set of DoD instructions that talk about essentially the type of meaningful human control that should be involved with certain types of use of force decisions. So even though AI is coming, I think there's going to be certain types of decisions where you will still have some degree of human involvement. And so I think that's kind of one element of this. There has been, I think, automation of weapon systems for decades. The CWIS system that we were talking about earlier, R2-D2 firing lots of bullets, that is an automated system. It's not AI, but essentially you put in parameters that say if there's something that is flying at you at this speed, this altitude, engage it, right? And you can operate it in this almost autonomous mode. So it isn't to say that autonomy is something entirely new. It's existed. That being said, I think there need to be very clear guardrails for the use of AI. And there's a few types of guardrails that I think are important to think about. The first is who's held accountable if an AI weapon system goes awry, right? If we think about a traditional military setting, if a pilot drops a bomb errantly and kills non-combatants, there's going to be an investigation, and they'll go try to figure out what happened, right? Was it something that was technically wrong with the system? Was there an intelligence failure? Or did the pilot intentionally go do this, right? And people will be held accountable depending on why this mistake happened. When you have a fully autonomous weapon system, it creates these vexing challenges that some scholars, especially in the legal realm, have referred to as an accountability gap. So if I have an AI drone, for instance, that a commander tells to go fly towards a target and go attack things, and the AI system attacks the wrong things, who do I hold accountable? Do I hold that unit commander responsible? Well, no, he told the drone to go attack a lawful target, not to go attack the wrong thing. And then you say, okay, well, who do I hold accountable then? Do I hold the engineer accountable who designed it? Well, that's really difficult because the engineer probably didn't have malicious intent involved. So there's these really interesting questions about who do you hold accountable when things go awry. And then the last set of, I think, important guardrails are how do states that are using these systems think about communicating in a crisis. During the height of the Cold War, the US and Soviets had all kinds of agreements of what would happen when there was some kind of collision between ships at sea, right? We had essentially communication processes that allowed us to de-escalate. How do we do that in AI realm? Because if you have an AI system engaging something, is it an accident? Is it intentional? Right? Adversaries need to be able to talk through these in order to de-escalate.
Any other questions in the room? I have a few more online. Yeah, Robert. Go ahead.
So Tim, in the introduction, had mentioned the potential for insect-sized drones. Now, imagine this is in the future, but in the context of the current interest in regime change, what role would these types of weapons use, and how far along are they in their development?
So several years ago, I was doing some field work in Israel, and I was speaking to an Israeli general, and I was talking about big drones. And he said, Eric, you're asking the wrong questions. You need to be asking about the really small drones. And so, again, there's a variety of use cases. One could imagine a lethal miniature drone that looks something like a hummingbird-sized thing that could fly in and carry out a very precise engagement. You could also have a very small asset that is going to do reconnaissance, flying through windows in a way that a large drone couldn't. And this technology already exists, right? There's very small drones that are the size of birds that you can, see online. Whether or not these have been weaponized, I don't know, but it doesn't take that much more, right, to weaponize a system like that. And I think we've seen, even in the recent conflict, how smaller drones, not something the size of a hummingbird, but something maybe the size of not much bigger than a football, can have. There's footage online of an Iranian drone flying through the U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad, right? And it is literally flying between buildings. And so basically the smaller the asset is, the harder it is to engage and stop, the more maneuverable it is. And I think that kind of threat is going to become more and more prevalent as technology continues to advance.
And what I've read, and I don't know where they are in development of this, but attempts to make a wasp-sized drone that would go and sting someone, inject a poison, and assassinate them. These are real things people are thinking about. Whether or not they're possible and feasible in the near future, I wouldn't bet against them. But it's an interesting use case, especially with the world we are now living in.
Everyone's going to be looking for large bugs flying around them as they leave today.
Okay, so we are also getting a couple of questions here about ensuring that we are utilizing drones in responsible ways when our adversaries are not. Where do you see the need for regulation? Where do you see the need for pushing forward to combat what other countries are doing?
Yeah, so what's interesting is international law surrounding the use of force, so the law of armed conflict, is silent about the distinction between unmanned assets or uncrewed assets and inhabited assets. So it doesn't matter in international law if something is manned or unmanned. What matters essentially is how these systems are used. So the argument that I think most international lawyers would make is that you could violate international law, you could use a weapon system irresponsibly, regardless of whether a system is an uninhabited system or an inhabited system. So I think existing law covers that, right? It's how these systems are used. Do we need drone-specific, restrictions? Perhaps in terms of like export controls and things like that to make sure these systems don't fall into the wrong hands. But maybe it's too late, right? If I can buy something on Amazon, so can the bad guys.
And then back to the escalation ladder. One of the things that people have sort of used to argue against your theory here is that the more steps you have on that ladder, the more likely there is for miscalculation. So are we actually making it easier for states to go to war because there are more options for impact? What is your response to that sort of critique?
Sure. So I think, as part of this remote revolution, I say there are these two divergent effects, right? One side is what we talked about earlier, this escalation control effect, right? If an adversary shoots something down, I'm less likely to respond to it. It might help temper conflict, right? Because I might be able to use a drone to carry out a very precise strike that would be much more escalatory if I carried it out using, another type of weapon system. The other side, though, of the remote revolution is what I call the moral hazard effect, and it kind of gets at what you're talking about. So under this moral hazard effect, you might imagine that if I'm a state on the receiving end of drone missions and manned aircraft missions, I'm going to be much more likely to shoot down drones, right? And so I'm not really scared of this because I could shoot down a drone and the other side's probably not going to respond. So yes, you might use drones more often, but we know from a host of experimental studies and other types of research that drones are viewed as less escalatory. So even if I see more uses, potentially that's not going to escalate. That being said, though, any political science theory is probabilistic. There's always some set of chances in which you're going to have escalation. But what I think is really important is that drones give leaders essentially a degree of flexibility that they might not have if manned assets are used. So even if I have, let's say, a drone attack on a major city, political leaders can make the decision whether or not they want to respond to that. In an interview that I did with a senior official from the Middle East, that official said to me, drone attacks are essentially like a radio dial. I can turn it all the way up if I want justification to respond, or I can turn it all the way down and if I don't want to respond. But having an adversary fighter jet fly into my city and bomb it, it's much harder to control the radio knob on that one.
Well, and certainly all of political theory requires rational international actors, which we do not always get. So I see we're a little bit past 7 o'clock, so I want to finish up here with one final question that I hope will leave us all with some great feelings. For those who don't work in national security, who don't have an international career, who aren't building drones for large tech manufacturers or defense contractors, why should any of this matter? Why should we read your book? Why should we care about this if it doesn't seem to impact our daily lives here in New Hampshire?
I thought you wanted me to give a positive answer.
It may have been a little sarcasm, but
so I think drones are here to stay as part of the international security landscape. And for all of us that are traveling or even just watching the news, right, we see how drones are fundamentally changing the ways in which states and non-state actors are projecting power. If you were flying through Copenhagen Airport in fall of 2025, you experienced drones when the airspace around the airport was shut down because of suspected Russian drone sightings. So this is a technology that is fundamentally changing the landscape of the international security space. States are going to use this for peacetime signaling. They're going to use it in military contexts in a way that potentially changes how we think about war, what war is, and where the boundaries of a battlefield lie. So not the positive answer you were looking for, but I think that's why these systems are so important to us today.
Well, there's not always the positive, but as I started the conversation with, thank you so much, Erik, for bringing us more than just awareness, but understanding about why this is important, where this is headed, and while maybe we feel like we don't have control, remember that your voice matters, your engagement matters, and your opportunity to speak and now have a more informed conversation can push things forward. So thank you so much to everyone who joined us here in person. Thank you to the Fulbright Association for their support and the Ayers family for their ongoing support as well. Thank you to our online audiences. And we look forward to seeing you on April 14th at our next event in this series that will look at the changing battlescape on the cyber side of things. We have one of the people who helped write the NATO handbook on cyber warfare and how we should approach that. So hope that you'll join us in person and online for that. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your evening and St. Patrick's Day.